It started, DJ, actually after I found your website and realized that you probably had the most resources in terms of Asian American churches, and you had a few posts on your blog about it, but you blogged about a lot of things very characteristic of you. There's everything that you're interested in your blog mentions, but there wasn't much stuff about kind of like narrating some of the things that I'd seen in Asian American churches or Korean American churches or Chinese American churches. And so after a conversation with you, you kind of said, well, Asians are online, they're just not talking about it. So Next Generation Church just became a place where I wanted to talk about it. And in the beginning, it was really easy. I mean, as I was doing youth ministry at a small Korean church at the time, and there's lots of dysfunction, and I realized I couldn't even teach our youth about forgiveness or reconciliation or love, because I mean they'd never really even seen it. They never really experienced it. Most of them had only, I mean, we besides our teaching in church and trying to raise them up and give them the gospel, they had never seen two elders reconcile. They had never seen any number of godly people prevent a church split from happening. Or, so it was just trying to name what was actually happening, whether it was problems with the immigrant experience, or growing up as a latchkey kid, or pastors who were just as much as they wanted to serve God, they also needed their green card. It was just all these tensions that were in the air, and I think for the first two maybe almost 3 years of blogging at Next Generation Church, it just seemed like there was lots of stuff to talk about. But I mean, I would say the last year we had some really tough discussions, whether it was about Francis Chan and this veneer of kind of multi-ethnic conferences with an Asian speaker who never speaks or rarely speaks on Asian American issues, if at all. And just kind of questioning that, not necessarily as a value judgment upon Francis Chan, but who does speak for Asian American issues? And it seems like African Americans have that. It seems like there are representatives, but in Asian American circles, it's just that didn't seem to be present. And it seemed like the most capable, one of the most outspoken, the highest platform, Francis Chan, he didn't really seem to talk about it. So it was just that was a tough discussion online. I mean, it got a lot of hits and it got a lot of comments, but it was a very tough conversation to live out and realize how so many of us were divided about what the value of ethnicity, the value of culture, and why does that play out, and how does that play out. So that was a tough discussion. The other question that was really tough was the Deadly Vipers issue. And that was a tough discussion because so many people that we knew were on both sides of the fence, whether it was being good friends with Mike Foster and some of the friends from Catalyst, that kind of crew, and then realizing that there was a lot of various voices in the Asian American community that didn't know what to make of it. Some said it didn't matter at all, and others saying, it's so crucial to educate all of us to whether white, black, we all need to know what is not cool, what is offensive, and it was really interesting when we had to say to other Asians, you should be offended, and trying to make the case. If this doesn't offend you, I mean, how do you think people who are not yet believers would feel? That was a really, how does this make you look to other Asians where this could be very hurtful? And it was it was a tough conversation. I definitely had relationships on both sides that just it felt very unsatisfying. I, somebody asked me, like, well, how could have this situation worked out any better? And I don't know. It's just, to me, it's one of those starter gateway conversations that brothers and friends need to have. But we never got to have it. I mean, just it started at first. It came off as being trying to correct an offense, and then the correction became an offense itself, and then I just realized how kind of twisted of a knot we're in, and it was a big turnoff. It was I shouldn't say not only a turnoff, but it was a big wound as well as a kind of a lamenting, kind of a season of lament for me. And but at the same time, it brought up a lot of dimensions of how complicated the landscape of Asian American church and what difference do we make in terms of larger representation, even though like books that were I think even in a small way were very influential, like Soong-Chan Ra's book pointing out the importance of minority churches and newer ethnic communities that were kind of vibrant in America, where everybody else was talking about how churches were kind of fading and kind of atrophying. And here Soong-Chan Ra was saying, yeah, but if you look at Korean churches, if you look at African churches, I mean, they're growing. Mm-hmm. If you look at Hispanic churches, they're growing. But from my purview, it just seemed like a lot of the minority churches that I knew didn't even know who they were. And we were still copying kind of this image of Christianity that we'd seen. And there was very little thought behind what does it mean to be an Asian American Christian. And I think the theological question is, what does it matter? What is the value? What does God really think of ethnicity and culture, and what's its value in the kingdom? I mean, it's there in Revelations 22, Revelations 22. It talks about the glory of the nations being brought in, and Revelation 7, the languages and tribes and tongues, they're all there. But somehow we have no room for that, even in our multi-ethnic discussions. We still don't know what to make of that, I think. And it's been a challenging season. I think I don't know what's next. I mean,
some people say it's too hard, so they don't do it. So are you discouraged? Do you have regrets?
Oh, no regrets at all. I think it's been one of the best places for conversation, and it's brought me into a relationship with a lot of people that I would have never met otherwise across the country. I mean, you're a great example of that, DJ. I don't know if I would have met you any other way, but I mean, at least 5-6 years now. It's been a very very encouraging and very just empowering relationship that I've had with you and others. I mean, Daniel So, Dan Ra, I met completely online. Lawrence Tom, all these people I've met pretty much because of the blog. And I don't know what's going to happen next. I think the question is, there's a lot of stuff on the blog. I mean, 3 years worth of content and change, 3 years and change. And it's just like, there's a lot of content on there. And, to me, the reason why it's somewhat, at least for me, the reason why it's having trouble moving forward is because I feel like there needs to be more community engaging that question together, rather than maybe like a critique or a kind of like a commentary from one person's perspective. It'd be interesting if there could be more creative or constructive. I feel like we've deconstructed it quite a bit. We know what problems there are with post-colonialism. We know what problems there are with assimilation and kind of second gen, third gen, language, blah blah blah, globalization. I think we've discussed that on the internet, on the blog for the last few years, and it's just like, now what? What do we do constructively? And I think that's where the gears have shifted, and there's definitely been some moments of stalling and like not knowing what to do next, or what to make of it. I mean, you know this. We've had more than a few talk boxes that have last hours, and we've done it. I don't know, half a dozen to a dozen of them. And but the real burning question is, we don't know what it looks like. At the end of the day, we still are wrestling with what it means to be Asian American Christian and what value that has. My suspicions are that it's valuable, even if it's just diagnosing our own pathologies and wrestling with our own dysfunctions. But my hope is that something more creative comes out of it. You know, when I look at African Americans, they have new songs that are come out of that experience. And I don't know if I'm expecting a song to kind of well up in the hearts of Asian American Christians, but I'm hoping that something new is birthed through this. And I don't know if we're kind of in the first trimester of birth, you know, that type of carrying something. But I think something's got to happen. And
well, let's dream a little bit. So look 5-10 years down the road. What would be an incredible move of God and a fruition of the seeds that have been sown?
Yeah, you know, I think there is a growing contingency of people around the country who are asking these same questions. So, like here you have, you know, post 1965, we're just now kind of entering our mid-30s or 40s, you know, and we're starting to ask these questions that our parents' generation just wasn't asking, or you know, they had other concerns, other preoccupations. But I think our generation is starting to ask those questions, and because of that, I think there's more awareness of the issues, or at least a growing awareness. I think deadly vipers prove that. It's a big concern, and even if you were completely assimilated, it didn't matter to you at all. Suddenly, you had to at least explain why it didn't bother you at all, right? And so I think that was a really good turn. So I think down the road, I think there needs to be, and I think a lot of immigrant groups are going through this. I'm reading a book called Christians at the Border recently, and same issues. What is Hispanic identity? Same issues are cropping up with other immigrant groups. And there's new narratives. I think just like with the African American community, they were talking about Exodus, right, throughout the civil rights movements. The whole narrative underlying that was Exodus. And now they're in a different narrative of exile. So very similarly, I think that theologically we need to frame our narrative, where we are in the narrative. And I think we're having a new flock of Asian American theologians, Asian American pastors. My only concern is that the speed of so Asian Americans, I think, tend to be pragmatic. So sometimes they live at the speed of whatever works, and whatever works fastest, most efficiently. So sometimes culture and the creation of culture and the thoughtfulness of identity is inefficient. It's a little bit impractical. So I do think there's kind of the other side of it where you're seeing a lot of success and a lot of excellence come out early, and that's celebrated. But there's, I think, behind that, the second wave is going to be a little bit more thoughtful and nuanced in the way they approach it. Maybe a little bit more adventurous, so they might not be the Asian American church mega church pastor. You know what I mean? They might not be the. I think there might not. It might be a while before you see another Francis Chan, and even I would say Francis Chan is probably I think he's unusual, and I don't know if you can attribute that to his cultural roots, but he's certainly very reflective, self-reflective, and introspective in ways that I haven't seen other megachurch pastors be, and I wonder if that can be attributed to his heritage. But I think when I look into the future, I think something is stirring, something is brewing in the hearts of Asian American Christians. Maybe not all, but a growing amount of them.
Let's ask the question a different way. What would give you incredible joy and satisfaction if you saw something happen? What would that look like?
What would it look like? I think when I see Asian Americans, particularly Christians, begin to be very thoughtful about the effects of post-colonialism then they're going to have to critique power, because what I see power doing in you know the 21st century is you see this huge shift of power and culture making possibilities shift back to our motherland. So the Christian critique has to be there from people who once held power or are familiar with privilege, and I think, and I don't know if this sounds strange, but I think when you see the rise of China and the rise of kind of the focus of economy go there, there needs to be a separation. There needs to be a growing critique of, hey, you can't worship God and mammon. And I think a lot of Asian Americans can say, we did that. We tried that. We're actually really good at that. We're trying, in terms of trying to worship God and mammon at the same time. So I think when you have a rising economy in China and Korea, all this technical expertise, even I would say technical expertise that applies even to the way we understand church growth and church building, especially in South Korea. There needs to be a growing critique to say your prosperity will not save you, and all of that is not God ordained. So I think that would be a really interesting and constructive way of looking at or at least critiquing, separating church from economy in a healthy way. I do think that obviously the economy of the kingdom of heaven is going to work itself out, and I think we're starting to see that with a larger social consciousness. So it'd be really interesting for me to see that type of thoughtfulness that I think Asian Americans perhaps are uniquely positioned to do. Because we came here for that type of stability. And in the process we got saved. In the process we encountered Christ. Well, how would that encounter really affect us? To speak back to our countries of origin and say, oh, this Christ will not only make you wealthy, he will also make you poor and make you love the poor. I think that would be really powerful for me. What about you, DJ?
Well, here's a couple snapshots. It would bring me great joy to see first generation ethnic Asian churches give permission and blessing for creativity to flourish.
Yeah.
That the second generation obviously has incredible talent, obviously are incredibly blessed, the most educated, the most resourced,
right,
and to unleash that and allow that to flourish for the good of the kingdom, for the good of the church, for the good of culture would just be incredible. It's already beginning to happen in small pockets in pop culture.
Right.
There's no reason that couldn't happen in the faith community. And yet we wallow in our dysfunctions. We hide our wounds. We don't find healing. And we settle for a predictable narrative that's just numbing. And you've seen one church, you've seen them all, you hear one story, you've seen them all, and it's just tragic to me to see people's passions get set aside because of the quote-unquote demands of life. That'd be the biggest thing in the church world. The way I would describe when church has a multi-ethnic church that works for the next generation is that someone can walk into church and don't have to explain themselves and feel like they belong. And yet at the same time, that's not to say they ignored the ethnic identity and racial issues. So it's kind of that both and.
Right.
That that you're welcomed and invited in, and you have the safe place to talk about those issues. And that means church has to look very different than just church growth.
If that's a
or
10,
running people through a program.
right, and if that's a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, where are we now?
Well, the church at large is too busy running the programs
Right.
and trying to get people through their process and assimilation to go somewhere. But to turn that around and say, well, where's this person and where does he need to go? It turns the organization upside down.
Right.
And we're not very structured to do that.
No, I would say most of us aren't even culturally competent enough to take somebody else through the process.
So that's one of the challenges of being in a Western context. But then again, what context does that kind of thing happen in anyways?
Right.
I think when we look at the dream of the kingdom, I think that's what God's implanted each of us with.
Yeah, and it's tough because there's that missional impetus as well. Like, there's a large number of Asian Americans who aren't Christian. They may not have very good thoughts about Christians. So I think that's where Asian churches and Asian Americans still have a strong witness that a multi-ethnic church probably couldn't instill a sense of. They might instill a sense of missionality, but they're not going to help equip that particular voice of two Asian Americans. You know what I mean?
That's a whole other aspect of what needs to happen. That here's one of the things that adds to the difficulty of wrestling with this question of Asian American or multi-ethnic churches. And it seems like people try to frame it as a either or a dichotomy, that you could only pick one or the other.
Right.
The place I'm moving towards that seems right is we do need to have the conversation within our Asian American context because we've got unique, distinctive things that we have to work through together.
Sure.
But not to the exclusion of also being a part of the multi-ethnic conversation and community.
Good. Right.
And so it's not one or the other, it's that we need both in order to be fully formed. Because we need those who are different, the other, to help us see our blind spots. And then we need others who are like us to bring out the best and the values that we have within our culture, subculture, and heritage.
That's an excellent point. I think that most times we idealize multi-ethnic as kind of like the end point. But I agree with you that I think it's more circular. That if you're to think about it, strategic evangelism or strategic discipleship, and understanding that, okay, even if you can't villainize homogeneity, especially if your diversity means that the elements have to remain unique in order to be beautiful, or in order to bring about that diversity within unity. You still have to maintain that sense of diversity and particularity. So then you have to return to engaging mono-ethnic communities or the source of mono-ethnic culture, which is a more kind of monolithic thing. It's something greater than just an individual. I think that kind of, you're right, we try to separate the dichotomy, but it's actually not helpful. We actually end up in the same place of villainizing the one or making one a virtue at the expense of the other. And it's not true. It can't happen.
And that happens on both sides of the equation.
Right.
Both our Asian culture and our American culture looks for that one right answer. Isn't that funny? And we're Asian Americans, so we're caught right there.
Right.
So we find ourselves stuck.
Right.
And so a lot of people just hit the eject button.
Yeah, it's funny is our socioeconomics lets us opt out. Other minorities cannot opt out. You know, they still remain grounded. But when when we start to acquire white collar jobs or rise up the ladder, I mean, money talks, and that's where I think, you know, it's not a racial thing, but green is becoming the new race. You know, nobody cares, you know, what race you are, as long as you make money and you can buy your way out of that conversation, you know. But I don't know if that's a very Christian way of understanding the way we're supposed to live and engage one another. So.